Man is condemned to be free, not liberated, not blessed, condemned. That word does something strange to the sentence. Freedom is supposed to be the thing you fight for, the thing that gets carved onto monuments and shouted in the streets. But Jean-Paul Sartre didn't hand it to you as a gift. He handed it to you as a life sentence, one you never agreed to serve, one you can't appeal, one you can't even put down. Sartre wrote this in the early 1940s while Paris sat under Nazi occupation. German soldiers patrolled the streets he walked every day. Curfews dictated when he could leave his apartment. Censors read newspapers before the public did. And in the middle of all that, in a city where every visible freedom had been stripped away, Sartre sat down and argued that human beings are more free than they've ever wanted to admit. It sounds backwards. It isn't. Sartre wasn't just watching the occupation from the sidelines. He'd been drafted into the French army, captured by German forces in 1940, and held for 9 months in a prisoner of war camp. When he was released, some accounts say on medical grounds, others suggest forged papers, he didn't flee to safety. He went back to occupied Paris and joined the intellectual wing of the resistance, a small group of writers and thinkers who saw ideas as a form of combat. He wasn't smuggling weapons, he was smuggling a philosophy. And the philosophy he built during those years became Being and Nothingness, the book where this line appears, written in large part in cafes that German officers also frequented, under a government that could arrest him for the wrong sentence. Picture that scene for a second. A man loses his physical liberty twice. Once in a POW camp, once under an occupying government that decides what he can say, where he can go, what he can print. And he spends that exact period arguing that no one, not even a prisoner, not even an occupied citizen, is ever without freedom. Every rule the Nazis imposed still left something untouched. How he chose to respond to it. Comply. Resist. Stay silent. Speak anyway. Sartre insisted that even the narrowest cage still leaves you the freedom of your response inside it, and that this freedom isn't comfortable. It's a weight you can't set down, even when you'd give anything to. That's the real meaning behind the condemned. Sartre believed there's no script handed to any of us at birth, no God-given nature, no fixed destiny, no essence that tells us who we're supposed to be. He called this idea, existence precedes essence. A knife has a purpose before it exists. Someone designs it to cut, then makes it. A person doesn't work that way. You show up first with no manual, and then you spend a lifetime deciding what you are through the choices you make. No excuse absolves you of that. Not your upbringing, not your culture, not the Nazis at the end of the street. You can be pressured, threatened, starved, imprisoned, and you're still the one who decides how you respond to it. For Sartre, that responsibility never lifts. There's no version of being human where you get to hand the choice to something else and mean it. Even refusing to choose is a choice. Not everyone bought it, and the people who pushed back weren't fringe critics. Some of Sartre's fellow philosophers accused him of ignoring how real constraints actually are. Poverty, illness, the accident of where you're born. Simone de Beauvoir, his lifelong intellectual partner, spent much of her career sharpening this exact problem, arguing that freedom looks completely different depending on your position in the world, and that some people are handed far narrower choices than others. Marxist critics went further, accusing existentialism of being a philosophy for people comfortable enough to have the luxury of choosing, a rich man's freedom dressed up as a universal truth. Sartre spent years answering these challenges, revising and defending his position in later work, insisting that freedom isn't the same as power, and that even people with almost nothing still retain the freedom to interpret and respond to their situation, even if they can't change the situation itself. Whether that distinction fully answers the criticism is still argued in philosophy departments today. Here's where the quote gets twisted. Scroll social media long enough and you'll find condemned to be free, stitched onto a sunset, recaptioned as inspirational. You are free, embrace it, soft focus, cursive font. That's not just a simplification, that's the opposite of the point. Sartre wasn't selling empowerment. He was describing a burden so heavy that most people spend their entire lives running from it. He even had a name for that running: bad faith. The countless small lies people tell themselves to pretend they had no choice. I had to take the job. That's just how I am. Everyone was doing it. Every one of those sentences is an attempt to hand your freedom to something else. Fate, personality, culture. So you don't have to feel its weight. Motivational culture took Sartre's diagnosis of self-deception and turned it into the very self-deception he was diagnosing. It's a bit like quoting a doctor's warning about a symptom and using it as a slogan for health. You'll also see the quote used in a lighter, comic register. Memes about being condemned to choose a Netflix show or condemned to pick what to eat for dinner. Harmless mostly. But it flattens a wartime philosopher's argument about moral responsibility under occupation into a joke about decision fatigue. The gap between those two things is the whole story of how a serious idea gets worn smooth by repetition until it barely resembles what it started as. What happened to the quote afterward is almost its own drama. Being and Nothingness wasn't a bestseller overnight. It was dense, difficult, 600-plus pages of technical philosophy that few outside academic circles initially read closely. Existentialism became fashionable in post-war Paris, adopted by young intellectuals in smoky basement clubs who wore black and talked about absurdity and freedom, often without engaging the actual argument underneath the aesthetic. Sartre later grew uneasy with his own popularity, watching his ideas get simplified into a mood rather than a philosophy. He kept revising his thinking for the rest of his life, engaging more with politics, more with material conditions, partly in response to critics like Beauvoir and the Marxists who'd pushed back years earlier. He even turned down the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1964, saying a writer shouldn't let himself be turned into an institution, a choice that, fittingly, was itself an act of the very freedom he'd spent his career describing. So why does it still land? Because the thing Sartre was pointing at hasn't gone anywhere. Most people still want someone else to be responsible for the shape of their life. A boss, a system, a family, an algorithm, anything with a name that isn't their own. Sartre's answer was uncomfortable in 1943, and it's uncomfortable now. There's no one else standing behind the curtain. You're the one making the choice, every time, even when you insist you're not. Freedom was never the reward. It was always the sentence.